Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unfiltered Flow, ELSC. I'm Megan Cook here with co-host Alan Burdett. And today it's our pleasure to welcome Mr. Butch Cunningham to the show. Butch has spent over 50 years in the fluid power industry and most recently retired from Cunningham Fluid Power, which he owned in beautiful Ocala for over 32 years. Welcome, Butch.
Thank you. Nice to see both of you again.
Yeah,
Nice to see you, Butch.
So, Butch, with your long tenure in the industry, tell us how you got into fluid power originally.
Okay, it starts all the way back to actually when I was still in high school. My dad worked for Greer Hydraulics, and he covered the Midwest, and he only sold the Greer later line. That was their throwaway accumulators. Because my dad was with Greer, every once in a while, the hierarchy from Greer would be in town, and one of them was Zeke Zahid. Zeke was the chief engineer of Greer, and Zeke and I hit it off because I'm a mathematician. That's my background. And he'd come into town, and every time he'd come in, we'd talk and stuff, and he saw me. I was dealing with something with my dad, and we were talking about how do you size an accumulator. Well, back then, you either had a slide rule or you had log tables, and I did everything with logarithms. So Zeke thought that was pretty cool that I could do those things. So he's always kept in touch with me over the years. And then when I was in college getting out, he called me one day and said, "You need to come work for me." And I said, "Okay, where?" He says, "California." So Zeke said, "Come on out, go to work for me." Zeke really is the one that kind of talked me into really getting into the industry. And so I went to California and started working, and I was a quality engineer inspector for the line out there. And I got so bored looking at parts that somebody else already said was okay. So what I did is I started working on the production line, and I would build accumulators. And when the accumulators got all built up and I had nothing else to do, I worked in the paint booth. And then they put me in another position where I always had my fingers, and I was learning everything from ground up, every nut and bolt, you name it, that went into a bladder accumulator. Because Greer, that was their biggest thing, was the bladder accumulator. And then I became a application engineer. And then about a year after that, people would call in to get information or repair parts or whatever, or the new project. And I'd walk them through. I'd do all the calculations for them and just work it up. I knew every nut and bolt that went in any product. I could tell you the part number, the price, everything. Numbers were really easy for me. So I always liked that because I did well with numbers. And then I became service manager. And I was the service manager for almost 2 years. And then they transferred me back to the Midwest, where I was an outside sales engineer. And I covered about 2/3 of the United States and 2/3 of Canada. I was on the road all the time, but had fun. My little customers were people like John Deere and International Harvester, Caterpillar, little companies, you know.
Just the little ones, yeah.
Yeah,
But
the small
then
guys.
I ended up changing jobs when I went to work for Teledyne Republic. Worked for them for 5 years. I went in and interviewed with Parker, and before I left, I had a new job. So that worked out well. So I called on a lot of the same people I'd called on for years, the Caterpillars, the John Deeres, those kind of people. So I still had a lot of contacts, but I only worked there about a year and a half. I walked into a distributor in Chicago that was my distributors when I was with Teledyne Republic. And I said, "Do you have any jobs, any openings right now?" And he said, "No," but he said, "I'll make up one. When do you want to start?" It was that easy. So, because they had been my distributor when I was with Teledyne for 5 years, so they knew me pretty well. And so I stayed there for about another 8 years, and then I had a little lull in my personal life, and we needed a little change of pace. Ended up moving to Florida. Had a job down here, which I didn't like, and that didn't last very long. And the next thing you know, I got a call from a company down here called Power Systems, and they were out of Alpharetta and also out of Lakeland, Florida. And I lasted about 2 years with them. They had dropped our best line, which was Atlas cylinders. They dropped the Atlas line, which I did not want to do, and I was the sales manager down here, and they went against my wishes, and they put on a different line because they knew somebody at a different place. So I quit working for PSI, and 2 hours later, I called the old regional manager from Atlas and asked him, I said, "What are the odds of me getting the Atlas line?" And so it was about a day and a half later, a few phone calls here and there. Next thing you know, I had become the new Atlas distributor for Florida. And that's what started my business. I started out of my house, out of the spare bedroom where I had a computer, and that was about it. And I traveled throughout the state. One of the best things that I did was doing that. Universal was rebuilding or starting the new earthquake ride, and I got in on the ground floor of the new earthquake line because I knew a bunch of people already there at Universal. And so the first big order I got was for all the big cylinders that make those train cars shake, rattle, and roll. And everybody kind of like, how'd you do that? Well, good contact,
Yeah.
Because of those relationships, I found new relationships, and it's really come along pretty well. And just one thing led to the next, And I've had some very good product lines that I actually represented, which helped a lot, made some good successes at certain places, and had some very good customers that were very loyal to me personally. So that helped.
Let me ask you about that. You've worked on a lot of projects over the years. So if there's one you could pick out that you thought was the most important, most enjoyable, whatever, what would that be, Butch? And could you tell us
the one that I had
about
the most fun on? We had a customer, a little customer, Rockwell International, and they had a little problem with the plane they had. Well, it wasn't really a plane. It was called the Enterprise. It was this first space shuttle that never made it to space, but was put on back of a 747. They had a problem on the space shuttle. They had a big servo block that had internal leakage. So they came to Greer and bought 2 120-gallon stainless steel bladder accumulators for leakage compensators, is what they were for, okay? Because they didn't have enough time to get a new block made. It was like 18 months to get one of these servo valve blocks made, okay?
That's a real Band-Aid, isn't it?
Yes, it was. But so we had that. And the problem was, once they got them in, they found out that they were having some difficulties because they were having some carbon black was leaching out of the bladders. And they really weren't sure why, but it was my job to go to Rockwell. They had the 2 accumulators in a clean room for me. I went in, disassembled them, pulled the bladders out. They had to send them out to a special cleaning, somebody that did the cleaning on them. And then it was my job to come back and put them back in and reassemble. And while I was there, the casser guy said, would you like to see where these go? And I'm like, yeah. And he took me out on the floor, and there was sitting the Enterprise, the space shuttle. He says, you want to go in? And I actually got to walk up, go in the side door, and the first thing you see on your right-hand side on that one was the toilet. And it was a ladder right next to it that you had to go up to get into the cockpit. I always thought that was so cool. It was so much fun, and so that was probably one of the better ones I worked on. I thought that was pretty interesting. And I worked at Universal for a number of years to finally come up with the best cylinder for the Back to the Future ride. And there's 3 vertical cylinders that made that ride go all over the place. And what they use today is still the same cylinder. Been in there for 30 years. And so that was a...
Let's fast forward from that. Recently, so much has been made about the advancements in smart technology and IoT and how they influence fluid power systems, as well as integration into modern machinery now. What are your thoughts on that and how the industry changed or has been affected?
Well, I'll go back to when I was working in distribution. And so that was back in the 80s, mid-80s or so. Proportional servo valves, nobody even understood them, okay? And then proportional valves, everybody just said, there's a little black box, that's what makes it work. That was pretty much it. I mean, nobody really understood how. So as it started to grow, more and more companies, I think, got involved in it. Then you ended up having people like Tempasonics, MTS. They were finding better ways and easier ways to put some kind of a device inside of a cylinder for position feedback or for velocity feedback. And so you had some of these newer companies at the time. I mean, they've been around a long time, but they got into our industry more and gave us new products, new devices that could do different things that other people were doing yet. And then you take that and you tie it together, and that slowly grew and grew and grew. And then you get into the software side of it, and some of the companies that write the software and what they can do, and they've made it simple for a lot of people. So I can go in now and pretty much, and I'm not an electrical guy at all, but I can program and I can see how easy it is. And I think our industry and the electrical industry, electronics group, the two of them have slowly merged. And now you're seeing where the proportional controls, the servo controls, whatever they are, even when you've got these, you've got torque motors and things like that you can drive. So now you have actuators that are driven with electric motors, but they're so precise now that they can do a lot of things that you may not even do with hydraulics. But you can marry the two together, and it's really been interesting. I don't read a lot of this stuff. I look at what's going on, though, even today, and seeing who's doing what. And every time you turn around, somebody's added more features and benefits to their product line because they can now interface better with somebody else. So I think it's interesting.
That's interesting, Butch. And talking about the evolution there, looking ahead for, say, the next 5 or 10 years, and considering what you were just talking about, what areas of knowledge or skills do you think people coming into the industry need to concentrate on and master?
Well, I think they need to understand how the controllers that we drive these valves with work. They need to understand. They need to have a good, strong math background. I think that's very beneficial. People don't seem to comprehend, but when you look at like a circuit board, you're talking about proportional controls, and then all of a sudden you're getting into it and you really look at the design, and people just look at this and say, what's that do? Well, that sends this signal to this thing over here. Well, how does it do it? Well, there's a derivative. Well, what's a derivative? Okay, well, you need a little bit of calculus if you want to know what a derivative, So a good, strong background in mathematics is paramount, I think. But it also, understanding how products work and what they do, how they actually function. We had a problem with a proportional pressure reducing relieving valve that would all of a sudden went a little haywire, and we couldn't figure out what it was. And surprisingly, my customer figured out when they assembled it, there's a little bleed hole inside on purpose. But when you assemble it, if you don't put it in the right spot, you can have a problem. So that was actually a technician at a customer of mine that figured that out.
And that goes to, Butch, you're talking about the controls background and how products work. I think there's such a huge value, and Alan and I have seen it obviously on the recruiting side through outreach, but some of the best sales engineers that we know in the industry, Butch, and fluid power leaders overall have really had hands-on experience early on in their career, and they've torn down pumps and motors and valves. To that extent, I think that's invaluable. A degree is great, and an ME degree, and any type of additional training that you have, but there's definitely something to be said about somebody who has been hands in product and had to troubleshoot it and just understand inner workings. It makes a huge difference on that sales engineer and even application engineer side of things.
I agree totally. I mean, I remember when I was working for, I think it was with Teledyne, and I used to call out in Iowa and around places like that. And I went to one customer, and he was having a problem with a piece of equipment. I can't remember if it was some kind of a harvester of some sort or something. And they said, well, the guy looked at me and he said, well, I don't know. And I said, okay. I went to my car. I always carried overalls in my car. Put on my overalls. I was a 3-piece suit, coat and tie up, put on my overalls, climbed inside of this machine to find his mistake. And he says, what are you doing? I said, well, the only way I'm going to find it is if I go look for it. And that was how I did things. So I learned how to put things together, take them apart. And sometimes you do it wrong. And then you learn because you made a mistake, but you learn from that mistake. And so you actually got in and put your hands on it, figured it out. But no, that's what I said when we were talking earlier. I would love to have gotten something going here in this town to get some people interested in the industry. And something simple.
Hold on, I don't want to cut you off here, but this leads into where we're going. I wanted to bring that up with fluid power advocacy and getting younger folks and engineers involved in the industry. And I think this ties in. What do you see as the biggest challenge in the fluid power industry right now? Would you say that it's lack of talent pool there, especially on the hydraulics guys in particular? And that leads into what we were talking about with, schools and teaching and that sort of thing.
No, I agree 100%. Like I said, the lack of good young people coming into the industry is really what a major problem. It would be nice to have some young talent come in and stay in and grow. A number of years ago, I was at UF and I actually did a presentation to a bunch of the engineering group that were going to graduate. And they invited me to come in and talk to them about being an entrepreneur in our industry and, explain to them. And these were some very bright young men, that had worked on the Big Bad Wolf. So they had some knowledge of what fluid power could do, but we just for some reason can't reach out or find the right avenue to promote this. And when you go to a college or even a junior college or, someplace, try to get them more involved. You've got a couple good schools, Granite Falls up in Minnesota. Okay.
Well, Butch, we appreciate your time today.
Megan,
Yeah, thanks, Butch.
Thank you.
It was good to see you.